This is revolutionary in our broader evangelical world. The storybook Bible, Jonah did a bad thing and he gets punished, and he did a good thing and so he gets better, cannot understand this concept. This is why I think we have to be so careful when we choose what books to give to our little ones. I make jokes about VeggieTales. I love VeggieTales. I probably would sit down and watch VeggieTales with Augie when he gets old enough. But we have to be so careful not to let those messages come to our children, or to ourselves for that matter, uninterpreted by the scriptures first and foremost and our Reformed tradition.
Hey, brother, do you still believe in one another?
Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it, to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said, What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give us a thought, that we may not perish. And they said to one another, Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you? And he said to them, I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, What is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to the dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, has done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the depth, into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and billows passed over me. Then he said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the root of the mountain I went to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought my life up from the pit. O Lord my God, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Jonah is an interesting book because, as I commented a year ago, Jonah is not necessarily the hero of the story. If anything, he is kind of the villain in some senses. But nevertheless, I think as we'll see today, Jonah still gives us a good example to follow in a sense. And that, I think, is really the centerpiece of this prayer, is that even as Jonah is going through all of this, his prayer is still remarkably filled with faithful sayings and trust in the Lord. We learned early on in Jonah that Jonah was a prophet during the time of the kings. He seemed to have been a sort of a court temple. He was in the presence of the kings in Jerusalem itself. And he received a calling from the word of the Lord. And this phrase, the word of the Lord, seems to imply a pre-incarnate, visible manifestation of the second person of the Trinity. So we're not just talking about a disembodied voice. We're not just talking about some sort of sense or impression, but the word of the Lord itself, himself, came to give Jonah this mission, to give Jonah this task, to commission him as a prophet to Nineveh. And Jonah gets up and says, no, thank you. And he goes the opposite direction. We see in that first section there, the repeated phrase, he goes to Tarshish, he boards a ship in Tarshish. The author here, who we think is Jonah, is hammering that he did not go where he was supposed to. He went the opposite direction. He went to Tarshish instead of Nineveh, which is 180 degrees the other direction from Nineveh on the map. And he boards the ship in order to flee the presence of the Lord. He probably buys out the entire ship itself. He pays the fare for the whole ship. And the Lord hurls a great wave, uses the language of weapons. He hurls this storm like a spear. He weaponizes nature itself to correct and chastise and judge Jonah for his disobedience. We get to verses 7 through 17, and everyone on the boat is crying out to their chosen deity, except Jonah. Jonah is asleep in the hold of the ship, oblivious to everything, totally dead to the world and dead to his Lord. The sailors begin to seek divine wisdom after they wake Jonah. He comes to the deck of the ship, and they cast lots to identify by divine revelation, sort of a strange practice in the Old Testament or the old world. Divine revelation that shows them Jonah is the source of this wickedness that is being wrought upon them, at least their impression of it. So they ask Jonah, who are you? Tell us who it is that has caused this great calamity. And he says emphatically, a Hebrew am I. He identifies himself with God's people. And he says, the Lord is my God, and he made the heaven and the earth and the sea. There's no small amount of irony, and it explains why the sailors were so afraid when he says that God created the heavens where the storm was. He created the sea where they were about to die, and he created the dry land where they were trying to get to. And so this one phrase that Jonah uses almost casually demonstrates that the Lord has total and utter sovereignty over what is going on, which is a theme that we'll see come back again and again through the book. The sailors say, well, what do we do about this? And Jonah says, throw me into the ocean, because I know that if you do so, then the storm will calm down and you will be saved. Whether he knew this because he's a prophet and it had been revealed to him, or whether he just was surmising that this was the case, we don't know. But the sailors are hesitant to do so. And we talked about how it was a little bit strange that these pagan sailors from cultures that had no qualms about human sacrifice were suddenly unwilling to throw Jonah over the sea as an appeasement offering to this Lord. And we came to the conclusion that they had been regenerated. They had come to faith in this God who created the heavens and the sea and the dry ground. And so they knew intrinsically that this was wrong, that there was a moral imperative not to do this. So they tried to row back to the land. They jettisoned all of their goods, all of their cargo. They were making for land as best they could. And when it finally became clear that they couldn't do this, they sought the Lord's mercy and saying, essentially, we don't understand how this is, but please don't put this man's blood on us, because you, Lord, have done as you please, right? The sovereignty of the Lord again comes to the forefront. They finally cast Jonah into the sea, and this is important. They cast Jonah into the sea, and then they worship, they vow vows, and they vow to sacrifice. They offer sacrifices. They seek the Lord, they acknowledge his sovereignty, and they worship him with what they have left. And then rounding out the chapter, the Lord appoints a great fish to come and swallow up Jonah. And we talked about how this swallowing of Jonah, although our popular children's books and Veggie Tales and other stories that we might read to our kids, paints the fish often as the vehicle of judgment, it's actually a vehicle of deliverance for Jonah. There's this interesting grammatical feature that happens where in 1:17, the fish is masculine. The gender of the word is masculine. And then when we get to 2:1, it switches over to the feminine, almost as if to indicate that the whale was pregnant with Jonah, that Jonah was in the whale and was about to be reborn into the world in a new way. And that brings us to our passage here today. I'm going to read 117, even though that's a little bit outside of our scope. I'm going to read it along with 2:1 to make the point here. It says, "The Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the whale of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish." When you look at the Hebrew text, 117 is actually verse 2:1, and 2:1 is then 2:2, and so on and so forth. In the original Hebrew mindset of how this book goes together, these two things were linked together. Him being swallowed by the whale and being in the belly of the fish, and then him praying was linked together in this sequence. There's a feature in the Hebrew that's called a vav consecutive. You don't need to remember that. Nobody is going to care about that. But it's a little grammatical feature where it adds this little character to the front of the verb, and it indicates a sequence. It's the narrative storytelling. When you look at Genesis 1, it's like, and then God said, "Let there be light," and then there was light. It tells you the sequence of events. Sometimes it indicates that it is a strict sequence of events. This happened, and then that finished, and then the next thing happened, and then that finished. And many of the commentators use this passage to justify a perspective of Jonah, where Jonah is this rebellious, stubborn prophet who holds out his stubbornness until the very last minute. He's swallowed by the whale, he's getting digested by stomach acid, and he sort of finally relents to the Lord and cries out for deliverance, and the Lord acquiesces in response to his prayer. That's certainly a possible interpretation. There's lots of good reasons in the text here to think Jonah was kind of a chucklehead and was not paying too much attention to what the Lord had for him. The other option is to see this as a way for the author of the text to situate this prayer in contrast to other prayers that are not necessarily talked about directly in this text. And I'm going to take that later view here, and I think it's important. This makes good sense of the text, and we'll explain exactly why that is when we get to the next little section here. But it also protects us theologically if we understand it this way. Jonah is already a book, as I've alluded to, that tends towards a sort of crass moralism or fatalism. We tend to read it as sort of an allegory of if you do the wrong thing, God punishes you, and when you finally do the right thing, he blesses you. And there's a certain level of common grace wisdom to that approach, right? The whole book of Proverbs are these proverbial sayings that if you do this, then God will do this. If you raise up your children in the way they will go, they will not depart when they are older. But we also learn in the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes that those proverbial sayings, although generally true, it's not a magic formula. And so we have this tendency to read Old Testament literature as though it was this sort of like equation that God punishes us when we're bad. He relents from his punishment when we say we're sorry. And we have to be careful about that. If we understand what I'm about to teach from the next section here, that this is not a strict sequence of events, that Jonah began praying before he was swallowed by the whale. And this is simply recording the prayer that was actually within the whale. It helps protect us from seeing Jonah in this sort of quid pro quo, this for that kind of thing. I think we should simply understand this as saying, Jonah was in the water, he got swallowed by the whale, and then when he was in the whale, he prayed. It doesn't say anything about whether he was overly stubborn or whether his stubbornness held out. It simply tells us that he was in the whale when this prayer occurred. He says in verse 2, he calls out to the Lord out of his distress. And God answers him. Out of the belly of Sheol, Jonah cries, and God hears his voice. This here tells us that he began praying, right? He was in the water. He was in the deep. All of this descriptive language we're going to see later on about how deep he was, how quickly the current took him. He was wrapped up in seaweed. His life was fading from him. It was in the midst of all of that he cries out in his distress. It's a pretty distressing situation. And Jonah, like all of us would, like even most atheists would, cries out to the Lord, even just out of instinct. I think it's kind of crazy for us to think that this man who's now been cast overboard and is being swept to the bottom of the ocean is sure he's going to die. Somehow, he overrides all of his instinct and his entire life teaching and refuses to pray to the Lord. It just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense of what the text presents here. Jonah was in the belly of Sheol. He was in the very womb of Sheol. And there is this interesting contrast that he goes from the belly of Sheol into the belly of the whale. This phrase, the belly of Sheol, is probably roughly equivalent to our phrase about being at death's door, right? It may or may not come from some sort of Mesopotamian mythology. It may be a phrase of sort of co-opted into Hebrew, kind of like our phrase at death's door is actually co-opted in from Greek mythology, where there were actually literal doors to the underworld and people would go there when they were about to die. Jonah's point is that this was not a small thing. When we watch VeggieTales, he gets thrown in the water and like 13 seconds later, the whale comes up and takes him. Jonah was swept down into the water, almost supernaturally quick. He was drawn down to the very bottom of the ocean. We talk about the miracle of him surviving in the whale, and it was miraculous for sure. But the miracle of him being swept to the bottom of the ocean and not being crushed by the weight of the water, by the pressure, is equally miraculous. It's no more difficult for God to do that than it is for him to preserve him in the whale, or to raise Jesus from the dead, or to create everything from nothing. He finally starts to catch up with the pagan sailors. A theme in Jonah is that everyone around Jonah who shouldn't know any better somehow gets to the right conclusion before he does, right? The sailors begin to worship the Lord. They recognize this is divine wrath while Jonah is still asleep in the hold. Later, we'll see that the Ninevites recognize God's mercy and grace and thank him for it. And Jonah is still mad because the plant he was sitting on dies, right? Jonah is constantly behind the curve, but for this little moment, for this glimpse in the very center of the book, the pinnacle of the book is Jonah finally catching up to the sailors. He recognizes that it was God who cast him into the depths. This teaches us something about the doctrine of sovereignty and how it relates to human freedom, right? We often ask the question, what causes rain? Well, you can answer that by saying tiny particles of dust collect water in the air, and once they have enough weight, they fall out of the sky because the air can't hold them up anymore. That's true, and it's good, and that's what nature teaches us. It's also equally true that God causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike, and those two things are not contradictory. So when Jonah says, "You cast me into the sea," he's recognizing, like Joseph does in the book of Genesis, that what the sailors in this case meant for good, but what the brothers meant for evil, God purposed and caused for good. What the sailors did by their own volition, their own free will, they exercised their own autonomy in the horizontal sense to cast Jonah into the sea. God also cast him into the sea. As I said, the text here uses language that we may not catch in our English translations to indicate that it's not just the sea here that's the problem. God's sovereignty continues to affect and act on Jonah. The word that we read here as the water or the flood, other places refers to the current of a river. The Euphrates itself is sometimes referred to this, the largest river apart from the Nile that the Egyptian or the Israelite mind would have is the Euphrates, right? This underwater river, this underwater current, the undertow, sucks him to the bottom of the ocean. It's like if you're swimming at the beach at the ocean and you get caught in the undercurrent. There's not a lot you can do about it. Sometimes even the strongest swimmers can't overcome this. And Jonah, in all of his Middle Eastern robes, all of this stuff, probably with all of his baggage, his own equipment, things he had on him, is caught in this undercurrent that sucks him to the bottom of the ocean. And it's not just below the surface of the water. He's dropped down into the heart of the sea, the very core. We're seeing this language of him being pulled to the depths. In chapter 1, he goes down down, down. And now he's being drawn into the belly of the ocean, into the pit of Sheol, into the heart of the waters. The picture here is that Jonah doesn't just get thrown in the water and sink. He is actively pulled down to the bottom. This is not just a judgment where perhaps he can swim to the top. Just as the mariners hopelessly tried to reach land, Jonah would have been hopelessly trying to swim against this. We don't actually have any indication he tried, but had he tried, there would have been no chance. He goes on to say that the God's breakers and his waves roll him. This is the picture we see if you ever watch surfing competitions on the ocean, where a surfer will get hit by the wave and he just gets rolled over and rolled over and rolled over. And it can be incredibly dangerous. That's why they have like the little lifeguards on the jet skis that zip out there to get them. Because when you get caught in that breaker, you just get rolled over and rolled over and rolled over. And soon you lose track of which direction is up. And even if you did, you couldn't get out. This process is not just the forces of nature doing what they do. This is, again, the Lord weaponizing the forces of nature to execute judgment on Jonah. This tumultuous and supernatural rapid descent showed Jonah that this is not only the moment in which God wanted to take his life, but was actively casting him away from the presence of the Lord. It says here in verse 4, Jonah says, I am driven away from your sight. If you do a word study on this, you start to see that Jonah is pulling language from the creation account. He's pulling language from the fall. He's pulling a lot of language from Genesis itself. He's also pulling from the Psalms, which are pulling from the Genesis account. This word driven away could also be translated as banished. He's cast out of the presence of the Lord. Just as in Genesis 3, we read, God drove the man out at the east of the Garden of Eden. He placed cherubim and flaming sword. He drove the man out. Genesis 4:14, Cain says, you have driven me away from the ground. And in Jonah 1:3, we see that Jonah was trying to get away from the presence of the Lord. And I wonder if there was this moment where he goes, ooh, I guess I got what I was looking for. The second half of Jonah 2:4 here does something a little bit weird, and it's hard to translate. I think we should be honest at times. Hebrew is a language that, in some senses, is mysterious to us at times. There are still parts of the Hebrew Bible that we're not always 100% sure of. This verse here could be translated, in Hebrew, it's just a statement. It's, I shall again see the holy temple, your holy temple. How that fits into the text itself is tricky. Some read it as a question. How shall I see your holy temple? It's actually a statement kind of reaffirming the doubt and the fear and the idea that God was banishing him. Most translations translate it as sort of a contrast. He says, I was driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look on your holy temple. The force of this is, even though you're driving me away, even though you're casting me out of your presence, I have faith, I have confidence that I will again see your holy temple. The question here, and this is where I think Jonah becomes our example. It's certainly possible that Jonah was asserting his belief that he would be rescued from this calamity and he would make his way back to Jerusalem and he would return to the holy temple. I think that what he says in the rest of this, he's recounting what he was praying. What he was praying in this context is not that he would return to the temple. He was confident God was taking his life. He says in verse 5, the waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. The other way that the phrase holy temple is used in the Old Testament is to refer to the place that God lives in heaven. Jonah was asserting faith that even though he was being cast out of the presence of the Lord in this life, even though he was being justly punished for his sin, even though he was about to enter the belly of Sheol and to enter the pit, the very abyss, that he would see God again in his holy temple. This is a statement of Jonah's belief in his own destiny as one of God's people, destined to be saved by faith in God. In this moment, Jonah trusts the Lord, despite all of the appearances that God was out to get him. It's not all that different than when we read in Mark chapter 9, where this father brings his demon-possessed child to Jesus, and Jesus says, I can heal him. And he says, if you can do anything, Lord, I'm paraphrasing. He says, if you can do it, please, Lord. And he says, if all things are possible for me. And the father desperately cries out, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. It's this raw, unfiltered statement of just the human condition on this side of glory. Right? I believe in the Lord, but there's always that little part in the back of my head that isn't sure, because we're never going to be perfect. Now, I've said before, and this is becoming my new catchphrase, I think, I'm not here to rob you of your assurance of faith. Our confession, the Bible, this church, our broader Reformed tradition, the assurance of faith of the Christian is the rightful possession inheritance of every person in this room who trusts the Lord. But it is a reality that at times that assurance is shaken. And if there's ever a time for your assurance to be shaken, it's when you're being dragged to the bottom of the ocean, right? One of the words in here, I don't actually have it in my notes for some reason, but one of the words here, it's about the roots of the mountain, I believe, in the next verse. It's not just that he was dragged to the bottom of the ocean. This word root of the mountain is like the word that's used to cut. He's not just being dragged to the bottom of the sea. He's being dragged to the bottom of a deep sea crevasse. He's literally being pulled into the pit, right? Many in the ancient Semitic world would have seen these underwater pits. They would have theorized or thought about these underwater crevasses as the actual entry into Sheol. And Jonah sees himself being drawn down into these things. Yet, he believes he will see the good presence of the Lord. We read a similar statement. I won't make us go there for time. We read a similar statement in Job. Job goes through this long speech about all the things that God has done to him. And at the very end of it, he says, yet I will see the Lord with my eyes, and he will stand up next to me on the earth, right? Even though Job was going through this unimaginable grief, and we know that Job didn't deserve it in the strict sense, he still was saying, I'm going to be destroyed. God is shooting arrows at me, right? His sword is in my side. He's targeting me. He's sending hornets after me. All of these terrible, vibrant images that he's using to show what God is doing to him. And yet he still trusts. I would say that he trusts that he would see the Lord in the flesh. This is not only Jonah's faith, or Job's faith, it's a prophecy of Christ. This is alien to our modern mindset. We've been talking about this in the Psalms. Weston's been leading us through the lament Psalms. We often think that suffering and trials and difficulties are the opposite of blessing and favor. And we might recognize that in some sort of way that in God's economy, one thing leads to another. And again, there's an element of truth to that. James says, count it all joy when you face trials of every kind. He's not saying that the trials you're facing are in themselves joyful. You don't have to love when you get sick. You don't have to man up and put a smile on or pull yourself up by your bootstraps or whatever analogy you want to use. It's okay to be sad when bad things happen. It's actually good, right? If we're to weep with those who weep, there's an element of sadness that must come with that. Not to mention the one who's weeping is not chastised. But the idea that that only leads to this, that's just one step in the chain, that's not really the mindset the Bible has. All across the Psalms, in the lament Psalms, all across the prophetic literature, the book of Lamentations, Habakkuk has this long prayer at the end that's very similar. The entire book of Job, suffering and sanctification, trials and joy and restoration, they're all sandwiched right there. And there is usually this statement in the middle of it that God will do what is right. This is Jonah's example for us. And what an example it is. We'll talk in a little bit about all the ways that this whole scenario is typological of Christ. We'll get to that. But just for a minute in the middle of this book, Jonah is not such a bad guy. And it's because he still has all his faults that he can be this example for us. As though it wasn't clear enough, Jonah in verse 5 says that the purpose of the waters closing over him was explicitly to take his life. He's now in the belly of the sea. He's being dragged down to the very roots of the mountain, to the very core of the earth in his mind. He thinks he's going to hell in the Hebrew mind. There's both this idea that God is dragging him to hell in a very real sense. The Hebrew mind, Sheol was a physical place that people went to. And we learn more about it, and that becomes clarified as Revelation is progressive, not contradictory, but as it's clarified. But he uses this word deep, and this is where he's drawing again from Genesis. Genesis 1:2, he says, the earth was without form and void, the darkness was over the face of the deep. The deep is this sort of like unformed, chaotic water. It's what exists before God makes everything orderly and good. And in the fall, and especially in the flood, in chapter 7, verse 11, the flood itself is a sort of undoing of the order. God opens the floods from beneath, from the bottom of the earth, from the wellspring of the deep, as well as the chaotic waters from outside the firmament, and it all pours back in together, and the entire world becomes again this deep, primordial, chaotic water. And just as in Genesis, God separates the land, in Genesis 7 or in Genesis 8, he separates out the land by drying up the water. We also see that Jonah has this trust that he will return to the dry land. Again, he's the God of heaven and sea and dry earth. We could even read this phrase, depending on the context, as the abyss, which is this, again, is some borrowed language from Greek here that the Hebrews use, but it's this deep, watery, murky place full of shadows and darkness. Sounds familiar, I think, right? Christ says that those who are apart from him, who refuse to obey, will be cast into the outer darkness. This is the imagery that Jonah is seeing. All outside visible indicators was that he was going to die and he was going to hell. Yet he trusted in the Lord that he would see his holy temple again. Apart from God's gracious intervention, Jonah was right. So although God is the one that's bringing him to the depth, bringing him to the pit, dragging him down, using the very currents of the sea, weaponizing these underwater currents that only thousands of years later do we understand, and even then only this much, he also graciously rescues him from this by miraculously appointing a whale or a great fish who comes and swallows Jonah, takes him whole, and keeps him there in his own belly, keeps him there in her own womb when we get to chapter 2. In chapter 6, or in verse 6, Jonah makes this pivot. Again, he says he's brought to the very bottom of the sea, to the roots of the mountain, which is these deep underwater trenches. He conceptualizes himself now in this locked city behind bars. Again, this jail imagery, this pit imagery, it's all meant to evoke this idea of the final punishment of the wicked. This place of murky, gross water, this place of darkness and limitations of freedom. He's being taken there. This is the section here where people would actually argue that Jonah dies. He actually dies and is resurrected when he's swallowed by the whale. This comes from language where it says God does not prevent him from going to the pit. God actually draws him to the pit and then raises his life up from the pit. Now, I'm not convinced that we should think that Jonah actually died. I don't think that the text fully supports that. But it certainly is using this imagery. This is where we get to some typology about Christ. This is where Jonah really shines as a prophet. Sometimes people wonder why the book of Jonah is considered a prophetic book. And this, along with it, is part of that. Jonah, although the sign of Jonah in Matthew and in the other Gospels refers to the belly of the whale, that just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so also Christ will be in the heart of the earth, the pit, for 3 days and 3 nights. When we're talking about typology, we can't get too tripped up on the details. We're not talking about strict allegory where this figure is that person and this signpost represents that thing. This isn't Pilgrim's Progress or Chronicles of Narnia, which is not allegory, but it's similar. Typology functions often on sort of these big picture concepts, right? Although there are some typological references that are super detailed, there are also some that are just sort of evocative. The idea that Jonah died and was raised to life and sort of incubated in the earth, incubated in the whale, and sort of reborn into the world, that certainly sounds a lot like a picture of the resurrection. And I think we should see it that way. When Christ says that the sign of Jonah is roughly his resurrection, he is tying it to the 3 days and 3 nights, but he's not limiting to that. Jonah comes to this pivot, and now he starts to reflect on the context of his deliverance. This whole prayer should be seen sort of in the light of the Thanksgiving Psalms. There's a situation in which Jonah is in, and then God rescues him, and he begins to praise him for it. There's elements of lament, but it's really a Thanksgiving psalm that he's drawing on here, or that he's writing. In 2:7, Jonah is either dead or he's actively dying. I don't know about you, but if you've ever dove into a pool and got a little deeper than you thought you were, and there's that like 2 seconds before you get to the top where you're sure the lights are going out and you've really only been underwater for like 45 seconds. But everything in you tells you if you don't get there, you're going to die. Every instinct you have is to scramble for the surface. Think about how long it took Jonah to be dragged to the bottom of the ocean. Even at this accelerated pace, we're talking about a long time. And we have no reason to believe, and lots of reasons to think otherwise, Jonah was not preserved from the pain and the terror and the difficulty of feeling like you're drowning, because he was drowning. He was without oxygen. His life was fading away. And it is in this context of him being on the brink of death, at death's door, in the belly of Sheol, being drawn into the very pit itself, that his prayer reaches the Lord in his holy temple. Right? This gives further evidence to the thought that Jonah is not talking about the temple in Jerusalem. There was theology, and I think it's fine theology, that God lived in the temple in a special way. This is the reason that Daniel faces Jerusalem when he prays. There is a sense in the Old Testament that God's special place of presence is the temple in Jerusalem, and that the prayers of the people physically go to that place to be received by God. But Jonah doesn't know which direction the temple is. He's underwater. He's been tossed around by breakers. He has no sense of geography at this point. He knows that his prayers are reaching the Lord in his heavenly temple. And they reach him in his heavenly temple just as his life is being lost in the pit. And it is from this moment that God raises him to life, or preserves his life, depending how you read it, and appoints the whale to come reach him. And some read this next verse as a little bit of a step back. And it may be. He reads, "Those who pay vain regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. And what I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord." Jonah didn't see the sailors on the ship vow their vows and offer their sacrifices. That happened after they threw him into the pit and the current sucked him under. So we may read this with a little bit of a thank God I'm not like that tax collector kind of a lens. And there's probably some wisdom for us in that, to recognize that Jonah still hasn't quite gotten there. But it's also very common in the Old Testament to recognize that God treats his people differently because they are different. God brings people to a place of sanctification, and through that process of sanctification, they cease to worship vain idols. And it is absolutely true that those who worship vain idols forfeit their hope of steadfast love from the Lord. That's straight out of the Ten Commandments, right? He visits the iniquity of, specifically of idolatry. He visits the iniquity unto the children to the third and fourth generation. But for those who love the Lord, he loves them with a steadfast love unto thousands. We can recognize in Jonah that although he had made great progress in faith, that he still wasn't there yet. And we can recognize that in him because we can recognize that in ourselves. Jonah is the example in this because he is not perfect, because he has not arrived, because he doesn't do a 180 about face and get everything right going forward. We can read this in light of Jonah in chapter 4, where he takes big steps back. Or we can read this as the regular up and down progress of sanctification in the life of all believers everywhere. It is also ironic, again, we're back now to Jonah being a little bit behind the curve. He was sent to Nineveh to evangelize the heathens, some of the worst enemies that Israel was going to face. And he ignores that call. And he, instead of going to Nineveh, he goes to Tarshish. He goes the opposite direction. And he does something that would be unthinkable to most Israelites. He goes out on the open ocean. That's just insanity to someone living in the ancient world. He should have recognized that the sailors were fearing the Lord when they refused to throw him overboard. I think we all have a sort of innate sense when someone's behavior suddenly changes. And I think most of us, and not in some sort of strange, kooky, charismatic sense, but I think most of us can sort of go, I think I know why that is. Right? When you see someone at work that suddenly stops lying about everything and stops backbiting and stops taking credit for other people's work, and then you find out a little while longer that they've come to faith in Christ, if we're being honest, we're not all that surprised. But Jonah doesn't get it. Jonah here promises the same things that the sailors already did. So now we're again back behind the curve. To wrap this out, I want to ground this in something that I think is really vital for us to understand. As I said, Jonah is an example to us because he demonstrates the limited nature of sanctification. But he also demonstrates, in a certain sense, the fact that sanctification is real and has real effects. So this is a little out of the ordinary, but grab your Trinity hymnal from the pew in front of you. If you happen to have a copy of the confession, you could use that if you'd prefer. But open with me to page 927. I've been broadly reformed most of my Christian life and didn't realize it until I got to seminary. And since I discovered the Westminster Confession of Faith a decade ago, it's not new to me, I realized how valuable this resource was. This is essentially a search engine without the internet. And so I want to just read a little bit out of chapter 13 here, which is our confessions chapter on sanctification. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the first section here essentially says that sanctification is real and it happens throughout the whole person. We talk about total depravity, and there is a sense in which the Christian remains totally depraved after regeneration. In that there still is corruption within our entire being that is depraved. There's also an equal sense in which we can say we are totally sanctified in Christ, because sanctification is throughout the whole man, in which we are renewed after the image of God. So that's section 1. And then section 2 says this sanctification is throughout the whole man, in the whole man, yet imperfect in this life. There abiding still some remnant of corruption in every part, whence ariseth a continual and irreconcilable war, the flesh lusting after the spirit, and the spirit lusting after the flesh. Now that may feel like just a crushing burden if you stop reading there. But it lines up with our experience, right? This is Paul in Romans 7. The good things I want to do, I do not, and the bad things that I do not want to do, I somehow do. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We shouldn't read that as though somehow our spirits are purified entirely and our bodies are what's really causing us to sin. This is a picture of the spirit being our spiritual part of us. The part of us that's regenerated is willing, but the part of us that remains corrupt is our flesh. And our confession goes on to say, in which war, although the remaining corruption for a time may much prevail, yet through the continual supply of strength from the sanctifying Spirit of Christ, the regenerate part doth overcome. And so the saints grow in grace, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. This is revolutionary in our broader evangelical world. The storybook Bible, Jonah did a bad thing and he gets punished, and he did a good thing and so he gets better, cannot understand this concept. This is why I think we have to be so careful when we choose what books to give to our little ones, right? I make jokes about VeggieTales. I loved VeggieTales when I was in VeggieTales age range. I probably would sit down and watch VeggieTales with Augie when he gets old enough. But we have to be so careful not to let those messages come to our children, or to ourselves for that matter, uninterpreted by the scriptures first and foremost, and our Reformed tradition that we all believe. This is vital for us. When all is said and done, salvation, whether we're talking about justification, sanctification, glorification, resurrection, all of the different stages and phases of our salvation, it is entirely of the Lord. And it's for this reason that Jonah says, I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. This is the application of the sermon, loved ones. No matter how close to, or actually into the pit itself we have fallen. The chapter on assurance of faith, I won't go there, but the chapter in our confession on assurance of faith is very honest with us that our assurance will be shaken. And at times we may not feel as though we have any assurance at all. But even when we have fallen that deep into the pit of despair, even when we feel as though we are in the very depths of hell, no matter how much our spiritual or physical life is fainting away as we starve for spiritual breath, as we feel that impulse in us that recognizes we're moments away from losing the faith entirely, no matter how much the remnants of corruption in every part swirl around our heads like seaweed, how often do we feel wrapped up in sin? Whatever it is, I don't need to get specific because I'm sure all of you are thinking of something in your head right now that has been swirling around you for years. Maybe it's months, maybe it's years. Maybe you've never felt, since coming to Christ, you've never felt like it wasn't wrapped up around you like seaweed. Besetting sin is something that we need to be serious about, and it's a good cause for us to think hard and deep about our status as Christians and to go to our pastor and seek the elders' assistance in this. But besetting sin is not a mark that excludes you from Christianity. Right? We're justified by faith alone, in Christ alone, by his grace alone, not because we've overcome our besetting sin alone. Right? That's not one of the 5 solas. God redeems our life from the pit. From the very depths of hell itself, he snatched us like brands from the fire. And though it is the case that we often are shaken, and at times God, just as he let Jonah go to Tarshish. God had every ability to stop him from doing a stupid thing. And sometimes he does that, right? I'm sure there's plenty of times we can think about in our lives where we were heading towards sin and God just pulled a U-turn on us. And we are thankful for that. But there are times that he does not, and he lets us do that. He lets us suffer the consequences, and he does that to chastise us and bring us back to him. And even in the context of that, it is through this continual supply of the sanctifying Spirit of Christ, right? Christ was anointed by the Holy Spirit from the womb beyond measure. That's in the book of John. There was never a time where Christ did not have the totality of the infinite sanctifying Spirit of God. We do not have the totality of the sanctifying Spirit of God. Now, we can get into a discussion after the service about divine simplicity and all the complexity of that. But the reality is that God sanctifies us more and more and more. He does it by giving us the Spirit more and more. Might be more accurate to say he gives more of us to the Spirit. He gives us to the Spirit more and more. He gives us to Jesus more and more. We are Christ's inheritance. We are his bride. And just as the bride, as they're approaching the wedding, is made more and more beautiful, they start their beauty treatments weeks and months ahead of time, right? They're already making their hair appointments. They're already doing what they need to do to feel as beautiful as they can and to be as beautiful as they can on their wedding day. If that's the way we treat human weddings, guys do it too, just not as much. If that's the way we treat human weddings, how much more does God treat the heavenly wedding of his Son to his beloved bride? He's beautifying us, church. It doesn't always feel like it. Doesn't always look like it, but he is.
What if I'm far from home? Oh, brother, I would hear you call. What if I lose it all? Oh, sister, I would help you out. If the sky comes falling down for you, there's nothing in this world I wouldn't